Under the dim glow of a flickering torch, an old man leaned forward across the oak table, his fingers tracing the worn edges of a leather-bound manuscript. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Not all legends are lies. Some are warnings, some are truths we chose to forget." The room was silent except for the crackling of firewood. Outside, the wind howled against the ancient stone walls of the monastery, carrying with it the weight of centuries. A small group of listeners, scholars, travelers, and one curious young scribe watched him closely, their breaths held in the cool air. This was not just another story of knights, kings, and castles. This was about the myths they had been told were false, myths that had somehow been proven real, one by one, in ways no one could have predicted. The Middle Ages have long been painted as a time of darkness and superstition, where fairy tales mixed with faith and rumors could turn into truth overnight. For generations, historians dismissed many medieval stories as exaggerations, folk tales, or even deliberate inventions meant to control the masses. Dragons in the hills, cursed relics, forgotten cities beneath the sea. How many times have we read of such things and laughed them off as the fantasies of a fearful age? Yet, in recent years, researchers, archaeologists, and even amateur explorers have unearthed evidence suggesting that some of these so-called myths were not only rooted in reality, but have been waiting quietly for centuries to be rediscovered. One such tale began with a mysterious stone unearthed deep beneath the streets of a forgotten European village. At first glance, it looked ordinary, a carved slab with inscriptions barely visible under layers of soil. But the markings told a story passed down through generations about a lost fortress that supposedly vanished overnight during a storm in the 13th century. Local legends spoke of screams in the night, soldiers who never returned, and a ruler whose name was erased from history. Historians had long scoffed at the idea, calling it nothing more than a fireside tale meant to scare children. But when ground-penetrating radar revealed a massive buried structure where the legend claimed the fortress once stood, the line between myth and fact began to blur. It wasn't just a single story. Across Europe, Asia, and even the far reaches of the Middle East, medieval myths once mocked as fiction began leaving traces, physical proof, behind them. Ancient ships found where no sea had flowed for hundreds of years. Forgotten maps that, when examined closely, hinted at coastlines we only recently rediscovered. Even strange diseases mentioned in monastery journals, thought to be symbolic or exaggerated, turned out to describe real plagues that predated official records by centuries. Each discovery raised new questions. What else had the Middle Ages hidden behind layers of religion, politics, and fear? Who decided which stories would be called truth and which would be buried as myth? Among the listeners in that torchlit room was a woman named Eleanor. She was not a historian by trade, but her life had been spent chasing pieces of the past, tiny clues in manuscripts, whispered family secrets, and half-erased maps found in dusty archives. She believed there was a thread connecting these discoveries, something larger than isolated myths being proven right. Her notebook was filled with sketches of medieval artifacts, translations of forgotten Latin phrases, and dates that never quite matched official timelines. Something about this latest revelation, the fortress beneath the village, stirred a memory. She had seen its symbol before in a manuscript banned from public display and kept under lock and key in a private collection. Beside her sat Tomas, a former monk-turned-researcher who had once sworn never to revisit the shadows of his cloistered life. But the deeper these truths surfaced, the more he felt the pull of the past. There were things he had been told to keep quiet about, stories recited in hushed tones during midnight vigils. Myths, they called them, but they were always spoken with a strange reverence, as if to speak them aloud too often would wake something best left sleeping. The old man's tale went on, his words weaving a tapestry of kings who were never crowned, relics that healed wounds but vanished in a smoke, and beasts that stalked the forest when the moon was high. Most in the room leaned closer, eager for more, but Eleanor felt an unease growing in her chest. If even half of what he spoke was true, then the history they knew was not just incomplete, it was deliberately rewritten. Someone at some time had decided which truths deserved to live and which would be buried under the label of myth. Outside, the monastery bells began to toll the midnight hour. The old man paused, his fingers tightening on the manuscript. "You must understand," he whispered, "the past is not gone. It waits. These myths you call stories, they were warnings for those who would come after. And we, my friends, may already be too late to heed them." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Tomas, and in that moment, they both felt it, a quiet, chilling realization that this was not just about proving old tales true. It was about uncovering why they were hidden, and who stood to lose if the truth came out. The flicker of the torch cast long, restless shadows across the stone walls as the room fell silent once more. Somewhere in the darkness, a door creaked open, though no one had risen to touch it. The air grew colder, as if the very stones were remembering something they had kept secret for hundreds of years. What lay beneath that fortress? Why had its story been buried? And who, or what, was determined to keep its secret sealed? The answers, it seemed, would not come easily. But the first stone had been turned, and there was no going back. The storm outside the monastery grew fiercer as the night deepened, rattling the ancient shutters and filling the corridors with a low, restless hum. Eleanor clutched her notebook tighter, her mind racing with fragments of what the old man had revealed. She had come here seeking footnotes for her research, small pieces of history to stitch into a larger tapestry. But this was no ordinary discovery. The legends that had always been tucked into the margins of medieval chronicles were surfacing like forgotten bones beneath the earth, and each one seemed to carry a truth sharper than the last. Tomas leaned closer to the fire, his hood drawn back, his face half-lit and thoughtful. "Do you remember," he murmured to Eleanor, "the story of the knights who danced themselves to death?" She looked up puzzled. "You mean the dancing plague of Strasbourg?" she asked. It was one of those bizarre stories every student of history had heard in passing. A summer in the 16th century when dozens of people reportedly danced uncontrollably in the streets for days, some collapsing from exhaustion. Scholars called it mass hysteria, a product of starvation and stress. But Tomas's eyes held a different weight. They said it was hysteria, yes. But the monastery kept records no one ever read outside these walls. It wasn't just Strasbourg. There were earlier outbreaks, centuries older, described almost the same way. People moving as if possessed, music playing though no musician stood near, feet bleeding on cobblestones that should have been empty at night. He paused, his voice lower now. The drawings match something carved on the stones beneath that buried fortress. Eleanor's mind flicked through the images she had seen in manuscripts. Dancers with wild eyes, churches ringing their bells to drown out invisible tunes, physicians trying to hold people still. Could it be that these strange plagues were not isolated events, but fragments of a larger, buried truth? And if so, what force had once moved people to such madness? The old man watched them, his expression unreadable. "You see the pattern," he said softly. "Myths are only called myths until someone digs too deep. Then they become curses, and men with titles try to cover them again." He turned a page of the manuscript, revealing a delicate sketch of a tree growing over a grave, its roots twisted into symbols that looked almost like words. There were more examples he spoke of that night. The submerged village off the coast of Wales, once thought to be nothing more than a fable told by fishermen, had been found beneath shifting sands when a storm pulled the sea back unusually far. Entire streets, preserved in salt and silt, lay waiting, with carvings of saints that predated any known church in the region. For centuries, sailors spoke of hearing bells toll beneath the waves on stormy nights. Now, divers swore they had heard them too. And then there was the Iron Wolf, a story whispered in Baltic forests for generations, dismissed by scholars as a metaphor for war and conquest. But in 2023, a team of archaeologists uncovered a massive iron statue beneath layers of peat, half wolf, half machine, dated to a time when no such metalwork was thought possible. Its purpose was unknown, its origin uncertain, but its existence was undeniable. Was it a warning left behind by a forgotten people? A relic of technology erased from history? Or simply a coincidence that happened to look like the beast of legend? The listeners in that torchlit hall shifted uneasily. Some smiled, amused by the weight of these tales, but others, like Eleanor, felt something colder. If so many myths had turned out to hold truth, what else was waiting in the dark corners of the past? How much of what they were taught was carefully constructed, not to enlighten, but to pacify? Tomas broke the silence with a story of his own, one that had haunted him since his youth. There was a manuscript, he said, locked in the abbey vault. They called it the Book of Ashes. Every novice was told never to touch it, never to read it aloud. It was said to bring misfortune to any who tried. Most dismissed it as superstition. But when I was 16, the abbey scribe opened it by mistake. By the next winter, he was gone. His name erased from the records, his room sealed. No one ever spoke of him again. Eleanor's pen scratched across her notebook. "What did it contain?" she asked. Tomas shook his head. "I only saw the edge of page. Symbols I didn't recognize, and a map. One that pointed to a place we were never allowed to visit." The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the heavy doors as though something outside wanted in. The old man did not flinch. He closed the manuscript slowly, the leather creaking as though in protest. "You ask what is myth and what is truth," he said, "but you are asking the wrong question. The question is, who decides which truths we are allowed to remember?" Eleanor glanced toward the door, then back to Tomas. There was more to this night than stories. Something was coming. She could feel it in the way the monastery walls seemed to hum, in the way the old man's eyes flicked to the darkened corners as if expecting movement. She thought of the fortress buried beneath the earth, of the villagers who had vanished, of the bells tolling under the sea. Myths had teeth, and now they were biting their way back into the world. Outside, the storm broke with a crack of thunder, shaking the very stones beneath their feet. The torches flickered wildly, casting twisted shadows across the table. Someone in the room whispered a prayer, but the words were swallowed by the wind. The old man rose to his feet, his hand resting on the closed manuscript. "You came here for stories," he said, his voice carrying over the howl of the storm. "But stories have power, and once spoken, they do not stay buried." The door that had creaked open before now swung wider, though no hand touched it. A cold gust rushed in, scattering loose pages across the floor. Eleanor's heart pounded as her candles sputtered and died, leaving only the fire's glow to dance across the ancient walls. Somewhere beyond that threshold lay the next piece of the puzzle. Somewhere, the past was waiting. The storm pressed against the monastery like an impatient visitor, its winds curling around the stone walls and sighing through narrow passageways built long before anyone alive could remember. The night felt thick, heavy with the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks. Eleanor rose from her seat and moved toward the scattered pages that had been flung across the cold floor. Her fingers brushed against one, its ink faded but legible enough to reveal a fragment of a drawing. A tower, half sunken in the earth, surrounded by crooked trees that looked almost alive. Tomas joined her, crouching to pick up another page. "This wasn't in the manuscript before," he whispered. "I was watching. He never turned this one." His voice was low, but the old man heard him all the same. "Some stories reveal themselves only when they are ready," the elder murmured. "You cannot rush the past. It chooses who may see it." Eleanor glanced at him, unsure whether to take his words as wisdom or warning. "And yet you invited us here," she said softly, "to hear these stories, to see what was hidden. Why now? Why us?" The old man smiled faintly, a sad curl of his lips that deepened the lines on his face. "Because the world is digging again," he replied. "Because truths that were buried with care are being unearthed by hands that do not understand what they hold." He motioned toward the pages. "That drawing, it is of Black Hollow, a place wiped from royal maps in the 14th century. They said a sickness consumed it overnight, but the few who escaped spoke of something else, something walking among them that did not belong to any kingdom of man." Tomas shivered. his fingers tightening on the fragile parchment. That was a ghost story, he said. Children told it to each other in the cloisters. And yet, the old man replied, in the last decade, a team of surveyors stumbled upon the remnants of its walls beneath a stretch of farmland no one had thought to question. Bones were found, too many, too fast, all buried in the same shallow earth. And in the center stood a tree with roots that glowed faintly in the moonlight. Eleanor wrote quickly, her pen barely keeping pace with the words that spilled into the room. Her notebook was filling with threads, each one a myth she had once heard and dismissed, now bound together by this strange, heavy night. The storm outside shifted, carrying with it the sound of distant bells. Faint, almost imagined, but they're all the same. Several listeners turned their heads as if they, too, had heard it. The old man's eyes closed for a moment, as though he had been waiting for that sound. You hear them, he said quietly. Those are the bells of St. Lyris. They ring only when the tide pulls far enough to show the bones of the old city. Fishermen say it is a curse to sail near that place when the bells toll. But last winter, a ship anchored there to escape the storm. Only one man returned. Eleanor looked up. And what did he say? The old man's gaze lingered on the flames. He said the city was not empty. He said the bells rang to keep something in, not to call anyone out. Tomas shifted uncomfortably beside her, his mind tugging between curiosity and caution. He had spent years trying to escape this kind of talk, the whispered legends of the cloister, the forbidden books that promised answers no one truly wanted. Yet here he was again, drawn back by the same quiet pull. The group began to whisper among themselves, the room's earlier warmth giving way to a sharper tension. It was one thing to hear a story. It was another to feel as though you were standing on the edge of it. The old man placed the manuscript aside and leaned closer to them. You have read the chronicles, he said, his voice low but steady. You know of relics that healed the sick, of wells that ran red in years of famine, of swords that sang when drawn. Were they all inventions? Perhaps. But why, then, do the ruins remain where the song said they would? Why do the rivers still part where the map said they must? Eleanor's breath caught as another thought struck her. And the fortress, she said. You said it vanished overnight. But if it truly exists underground, untouched for centuries, what else is inside it? The old man looked at her then, really looked, as if weighing the measure of her question. Sometimes the earth does not bury ruins, he said. Sometimes it holds its breath. The storm gave another sharp howl, and somewhere far down the monastery corridor, a door slammed. One of the younger listeners startled, knocking over a stool. The old man rose, gathering the scattered pages in one slow sweep, his fingers lingering on the sketch of Black Hollow. You have heard enough for one night, he said at last. But you will not sleep easily. None of us will. Eleanor wanted to protest, to press him further, to ask about the tree with glowing roots, the city with its haunting bells, the fortress that might still whisper under the soil. But the words stuck in her throat. The fire was dimming, the torches burning low, and a sense of something unfinished clung to the air like mist. Tomas touched her shoulder. Come, he murmured. If we stay longer, we'll only hear more questions, not answers. She nodded, though her heart was unwilling. As they stepped into the cold stone corridor, the wind found its way in through the cracks, carrying with it that faint, distant tolling. It followed them down the hall, past the sleeping chambers and the old library door, until they reached their rooms. But Eleanor could not rest. Long after the others' footsteps had faded, she sat by the small window, her notebook open, the storm still whispering beyond the glass. The myths were no longer just stories told by firelight. They were coordinates, invitations, perhaps even warnings. And somewhere, beneath layers of forgotten soil and centuries of silence, something was waiting to be uncovered. The storm eased by dawn, leaving the monastery wrapped in a cold, wet hush. The bells that had whispered through the night were gone, leaving only the soft patter of rain dripping from the eaves. Eleanor barely noticed the change in weather. She had not slept. Her candle had burned low, its wax hardened on the stone windowsill beside her notes. The faintest light of morning crept across her pages, illuminating names, fragments of dates, and the jagged outline of the fortress she had sketched from memory. Tomas knocked quietly on her door. His hood was already drawn, his eyes shadowed with the kind of restlessness that comes from carrying too many secrets. "The old man is gone," he said. "He left before the morning bell. No one saw him leave." Eleanor set down her pen. "Gone? Just like that?" Tomas nodded, and he took the manuscript with him. Her stomach turned, though she wasn't surprised. People who carried truths like that rarely stayed long in one place. Still, the memory of his voice, of those warnings wrapped in riddles, clung to her. "Then we follow the trail," she said. Outside, the courtyard smelled of rain and ash. The other listeners from the night before moved about quietly, their conversations clipped as if each of them had woken with a shadow they could not shake. One of them, a young archivist named Julian, stopped Eleanor as she crossed the stones. "He spoke to me too," Julian whispered, his eyes darting toward the cloister arches. "Said the fortress wasn't just a fortress. Said it was a door." "A door to what?" Eleanor asked. Julian shook his head. He didn't say, only that it was sealed for a reason. The words settled over her like a weight. The myths were no longer just curiosities to be cataloged. They were connected, forming a path that seemed less like a series of coincidences and more like a pattern. The drowned city with its bells, the cursed tree in Black Hollow, the dancing plagues, the vanished fortress, all threads in a tapestry someone had tried very hard to unweave. By midday, the rain had thinned to a mist. Eleanor and Tomas prepared to leave the monastery, their belongings packed into weathered satchels, their questions too many to count. As they passed the old library, Tomas paused. "There's something you should see before we go," he murmured, pushing open the heavy door. Inside, the air smelled of dust and candle smoke. Tall shelves leaned under the weight of centuries, their scrolls and bindings curling with age. Tomas led her to a section near the back, where an iron lock had been forced open long ago. "When I was a novice, I used to sneak in here," he said. "This was where they kept the books no one wanted to burn, but no one dared to read." Eleanor traced her fingers along the cracked spines until she found one that caught her eye. Its title was faded, the letters half swallowed by time, but the emblem on its cover, a wolf with a hollow chest, matched the sketch from the old man's manuscript. She opened it slowly. The first page was a map, one that stretched far beyond the monastery's known borders. Villages long gone were marked with red ink. Rivers flowed where no rivers stood today. And in the lower corner, the fortress was drawn again, its towers sharp and dark, with a single line beneath. "Porta non cluditur," the door does not close. Tomas leaned over her shoulder. "I don't remember this being here," he whispered. "It shouldn't be." Eleanor turned another page and found something stranger still. Accounts of travelers who vanished in forests that no longer existed, letters from merchants who spoke of markets held under moonless skies, relics described in detail, and then struck through with heavy ink as if someone had wanted them erased from memory. "This is it," she murmured. "This is the pattern. Every myth he told us. It's here, hidden in plain sight." A sudden chill moved through the library, though no window stood open. The candle Tomas carried flickered, bending its flame toward the shelves as if drawn by something unseen. "We shouldn't stay here," Tomas said quietly. She nodded, but her fingers lingered on the page. The fortress was no longer just a forgotten ruin. It was a key, and if the myths had taught her anything, it was that keys rarely opened doors without consequence. By the time they stepped out into the gray afternoon, the monastery seemed different, emptier, as if the walls themselves had exhaled their secrets and were now waiting for something to return. The road ahead was slick with rain, winding between fields that still bore the scars of old wars and older legends. "Where do we start?" Tomas asked as they walked, the mist curling low around their boots. Eleanor looked at the horizon, where the land dipped toward the valley, said to hide the fortress. "We start where the ground remembers," she said, "and we see who else remembers with it." The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of burning wood and something older. Iron, perhaps, or damp stone long sealed from the air. Behind them, the monastery bells rang for the evening prayer, though neither of them turned back. Far in the distance, the clouds parted just enough for a sliver of pale light to strike the valley. For an instant, Eleanor thought she saw something glint there, something too straight, too deliberate to be a trick of the sun. The myths were no longer sleeping. They were stirring, one by one, as if the telling of them had been enough to wake them. The valley stretched before them like a hollow in the earth, quiet and pale under the weak afternoon light. From a distance, it looked like any other piece of forgotten countryside. Low hills softened by moss, a few crooked trees leaning against the wind, and the thin silver thread of a river cutting its way through the mud. But as Eleanor and Tomas drew closer, the air seemed heavier, as if the valley had its own weight, its own slow heartbeat. Tomas adjusted the strap of his satchel, glancing at the map they had taken from the monastery library. If the markings are true, the fortress should have stood somewhere along this ridge, he murmured, tracing the faint red ink with his finger. But this path wasn't meant to be walked. The locals said the land here was cursed, remember? Eleanor nodded, her eyes scanning the uneven ground. She remembered the words of the old man, the ones he had spoken like a warning. Some truths were buried, not forgotten. The fortress wasn't just a ruin. It was a story locked in stone, hidden by choice. Cursed or not, she said, someone went to great lengths to erase it. That makes it worth finding. The path wound downward, the damp soil sucking at their boots. As they walked, they passed remnants of things that didn't quite belong. A line of stones half swallowed by grass, the charred post of what might have once been a sign, a scatter of broken tiles glinting beneath the mud. Tomas paused to pick one up. Its surface bore a strange pattern, a spiral etched so finely it was almost invisible until the light struck it. Medieval tile work didn't look like this, he said. This is older, or different. Eleanor slipped the shard into her pocket. It was another thread, small but undeniable. The myths they had followed so far, the dancing plagues, the vanished cities, the cursed manuscripts, all spoke of places where something shifted suddenly, leaving behind fragments no one could fully explain. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of the river. It was narrow, more a band of dark water than a true current, but its banks were littered with pale stones that looked as though they had once been cut by hand. Tomas crouched, brushing away the damp moss, revealing a row of markings carved into the rock. Latin, he murmured. Faded, but I can make out a word Claudra. Close, Eleanor asked. He nodded. Or shut. The word sent a ripple of unease through her. Shut against what? Or shut to keep something within. They camped near the ridge as night began to pull over the land. The mist returned with the dark, curling low through the valley like smoke that never fully rose. Eleanor sat by the small fire, her notebook open across her knees, trying to gather the loose threads of the myths they had heard. Each story had a place, Black Hollow, St. Lyris, the Iron Wolf, and each one seemed to orbit this valley, this fortress buried and sealed. She thought of the villagers who had once lived nearby, their stories erased or turned into ghost tales told by firelight. What had they seen before the fortress disappeared? What had driven them to leave or to stay and be lost with it? Tomas stirred the fire with a branch. Do you think the old man meant for us to come here? He asked quietly. Eleanor looked at him. You think this is a trap? He shrugged. Not a trap, maybe, but a test. He gave us pieces, knowing we'd follow them. Maybe he couldn't come here himself. Or maybe he didn't want to be the one to open the door. The word hung between them, door. The same word Julian had whispered in the monastery courtyard. The same word carved on the map. Porta non cloditur. The door does not close. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of wet stone and something faintly metallic, like rust or blood long dried. Eleanor pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders. The myths had felt distant when told in the warmth of the monastery hall. But here, with the ground breathing cold beneath her and the night creeping close, they felt less like stories and more like memories pressing to the surface. She closed her notebook and stared at the darkness that pooled at the far end of the ridge. Somewhere out there, beneath layers of earth and silence, was the fortress. And if the legends were true, it was not empty. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was restless. The wind rattled the dry branches, making them sound like distant footsteps. More than once, Eleanor woke with the feeling that someone was watching from beyond the firelight, though every time she looked, the valley was still. By dawn, the mist had thickened, clinging to the ground like a second skin. Tomas was already awake, crouched by the riverbank, his hands cold from the water. He held something when she approached, a coin, worn nearly smooth, but the faintest imprint of a crowned figure still marked its face. "This shouldn't be here," he said. "It's older than the last recorded settlement in this valley, and yet it's barely buried." Eleanor turned the coin over in her palm, feeling the grooves where time had tried to erase its story. "Another piece," she said, "but not the whole picture." The valley stretched ahead, quiet and waiting. Somewhere beyond the mist, stones lay stacked where no builder was remembered. Doors lay sealed without keys, and the past hummed faintly, as if aware of their presence. Neither of them spoke as they packed their things. There was no need. The air itself carried the weight of unanswered questions, and every step forward felt like pulling a thread they could not yet see the end of. The village grew quiet as dusk settled over the rooftops, the orange glow fading into a pale blue twilight. Thomas leaned against the wooden frame of the inn, his breath steady, yet his mind heavy. He kept replaying every detail of what the old monk had told them, about the hidden monastery deep within the forest and the sealed room said to hold the relics of truth. It wasn't just a legend anymore. There were records, faint but real, hidden in archives that few dared to open. Eleanor approached him with a candle in hand, her face half lit by the flickering flame. "Do you think we're chasing shadows?" she asked softly, her eyes scanning the dark path ahead. "Sometimes myths exist because people need them to," Thomas replied, "but sometimes they exist because someone wanted them buried." Inside the inn, the group gathered around a wooden table. Old maps were spread before them, their edges frayed and markings faded by time. Brother Matthew pointed to a region marked with strange symbols, a place often whispered about in folktales, yet absent from any official charts. "This was called the Hollow of Ashes," he said, his finger tracing the faded ink. "Travelers avoided it for centuries, not because they feared what was there, but because they were told nothing existed." Eleanor leaned closer, and yet here it is, drawn by someone who risked everything to remember it. That realization sent a ripple of unease through the group. Why would anyone go to such lengths to erase a place, yet leave behind traces for the bold to find? The night stretched on, and the innkeeper warned them of the dangers that lay ahead. Wolves roamed the forests, and bandits prowled the roads. But there was something in his voice, a quiet tremor, that spoke of an older fear, one not born of fangs or blades, but of silence. "People who go looking for old truths," he said, pouring another round of ale, "don't always return with what they hope to find. Sometimes they return changed. Sometimes they don't return at all." No one spoke for a moment after that. Outside, the wind howled against the shutters, and the candles flickered as if something unseen had passed by. At dawn, they set out. The forest welcomed them with a hush that felt almost deliberate. Leaves clung to the morning dew, and the air carried a faint metallic tang, as though the earth itself remembered old blood. Thomas rode ahead, scanning the path, while Eleanor kept close to the monk, who seemed to grow more contemplative with every mile. He spoke of the myths they were chasing, legends of a king who forged pacts with forces unseen, a plague that spared only a chosen few, and an artifact said to bend the truth of history itself. What if these weren't just stories? Eleanor asked. What if they were warnings left behind, and we've been ignoring them all this time? Brother Matthew only tightened his grip on the reins. By midday, they reached a clearing where the ruins of a once grand hall lay half buried in earth and ivy. Columns leaned at broken angles, and carvings of strange beasts peered out from the stone, their eyes weathered but still haunting. The villagers said no one came here anymore, not since the last priest disappeared. Yet, as they stepped among the crumbling stones, Eleanor felt a pull, as if the ground itself wanted to share what it remembered. Thomas found a slab with markings similar to those on the map. "This is it," he whispered. "The path begins here." But just as his fingers traced the lines, a sudden rustle broke the silence. Something moved in the trees, quick and deliberate, but when they turned, there was nothing. The air grew colder as the sun dipped behind clouds, and an uneasy stillness settled over the ruins. They camped there that night, their fire crackling weakly against the growing chill. Around the flames, stories spilled, of knights who rode into the hollow never to return, of villagers who swore they saw lights moving between the trees, and of a scroll said to reveal the first written truth of the kingdom, a truth so dangerous that even mentioning it had once been considered treason. Thomas listened, his mind weaving the fragments into something bigger. Every tale, every whisper, every vanishing, was it all coincidence, or had they been warned in plain sight all along? As darkness deepened, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows stretched in unnatural ways, and the wind seemed to carry faint murmurs that faded whenever she turned to listen. She thought of the monk's word from the night before. Sometimes the truth changes those who find it. What if the change didn't come from knowledge alone, but from something waiting to claim them the moment they stepped too close? Still, they pressed on, driven not by greed or fame, but by the quiet, stubborn belief that the past deserved to speak for itself. Before dawn broke again, Thomas awoke to a sound, soft, rhythmic, almost like chanting. He rose quietly, following it to the edge of the ruins where the forest grew dense and black. There, in the half-light, he saw something carved into the bark of an ancient tree. The same sigil from the map, freshly cut, as though someone, or something, had been here not long ago. His pulse quickened. They were not the only ones seeking the truth. Or worse, the truth was seeking them. In the days that followed, Robert found himself walking the quiet paths of the village more often, his mind occupied with the stories that had begun to take shape. The villagers had grown used to his presence, and some even looked forward to his questions, eager to share pieces of the past they remembered. An elderly shepherd named Aldrich spoke of strange fires seen on the hillsides during his youth, lights that moved without wind, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. He had been a boy then, no older than 12, but he still recalled the way the village held its breath whenever the hills glowed. Nobody ever found the cause, and with time, it became one of those whispers that parents told their children when they warned them not to wander after dark. It was easy to dismiss as myth, yet there was a detail in Aldrich's voice that made Robert wonder whether there had been more truth in those old warnings than anyone cared to admit. Claire joined him on one of these walks, carrying her satchel filled with notes. She had been listening, too, and her notebook was already full of dates, names, and old sayings that didn't appear in any chronicle. "It's strange, isn't it?" she said as they crossed a narrow stone bridge over a shallow creek. So many of these tales share the same bones. Hidden fires, restless spirits, treasures that vanish when touched. It's as if they're all fragments of something bigger. Robert nodded, though his gaze lingered on the darkening horizon. He felt the weight of her words. Perhaps these stories were not random at all. Perhaps they were the remnants of something the people had once known, and in time had been told to forget. Later that evening, they gathered in the old manor's great hall again, the firelight flickering across the worn banners hanging from the beams. This time, more villagers came. They brought small tokens with them, a broken pendant, a rusty key, a strip of embroidered cloth. Each item had a story attached to it, and each story carried an echo of the same mystery. The past was speaking, but in riddles. Robert handled each object with care, not as a scholar hungry for proof, but as a man humbled by what people chose to share. These were not mere curiosities to them. They were pieces of their families, fragments of a time when their ancestors walked the same fields under a different sky. One tale stood out among the rest. It came from a soft-spoken woman named Eloise, who who said her grandmother once told her of a secret meeting that had taken place beneath the abbey ruins decades before the last war. Knights and monks had gathered in silence, swearing to protect something that had been unearthed during repairs. A scroll, she thought, though no one outside the meeting ever saw it. Within weeks, the abbey was struck by fire, and the scroll was lost, if it ever truly existed. Eloise did not claim to know what it contained, but her grandmother insisted it was the reason why the old bell tower was never rebuilt. They said the tower was cursed, she whispered, her hands clutching the shawl at her shoulders. But she always said it was fear that kept them from touching those stones again. That word lingered in the air, fear. It was something Robert had sensed in the edges of these tales, hidden beneath the laughter and the shrugging shoulders. People wanted to believe in harmless myths because the alternative was far heavier, that someone long ago had wanted them to forget for a reason. And yet, the more they forgot, the more the land remembered in its own quiet ways, through the cracked carvings on a church door, through a field where the crops always grew wild and tall, through the old songs that mothers still hummed without knowing their origins. The nights grew colder as autumn settled over the valley. Robert stayed longer than he had planned, feeling that to leave now would be to abandon a conversation that had only just begun. Claire was restless, her fingers stained with ink, her hair often escaping the scarf she wore against the wind. Together, they mapped what they knew, not in the rigid way of scholars, but as travelers might, noting the turns of the road and the faces of those who offered shelter. They noticed patterns. The myths were not scattered evenly. They clustered around certain places, the hills to the east, the ruins by the river, the stone arch that led nowhere and yet was always adorned with wildflowers. One evening, while the village prepared for a small harvest gathering, a stranger arrived. He was not dressed like a traveler, though his boots were dusty. He introduced himself only as Lucien, saying he had heard there were people asking questions about the old times. His voice carried the weight of someone used to being listened to, though not necessarily trusted. Robert invited him to join the fire, and Lucien sat with his hands folded, his eyes never straying far from the shadows at the edge of the hall. It was Lucien who spoke of a map, not of roads, but of memories drawn by monks centuries ago. It was said to mark the places where the boundary between the seen and the hidden grew thin, where truth might slip through if one knew how to look. Most believed the map had been destroyed during a raid, but Lucien claimed otherwise. He hinted that it had passed through many hands, some noble, some not, and that it might yet be found in the archives of a nearby abbey that had long been abandoned. He did not say how he knew this. He did not say why he cared. But the room grew quiet as he spoke, and Robert felt the same pull he had felt when he first stepped into the ruins, that invisible thread between what was told and what was left unsaid. Claire was cautious of him. She whispered her doubts later, as they walked back through the cool night air. "He tells too much without saying anything at all," she murmured. Robert agreed, yet he could not shake the sense that Lucien had opened a door. If the map was real, it could tie everything together. The hidden fires, the missing scroll, the tales of doors that never opened. But to follow his lead would mean leaving the safety of what they knew and stepping into a place where myths were no longer harmless stories. That night, Robert found it hard to sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and fallen leaves. In the stillness, he thought of the villagers' faces, of the fragile trust they had offered, and of the questions that now weighed heavier than before. Were they chasing ghosts, or were they stirring something that had been waiting to be found? The myths had survived for centuries, not because they were loud, but because they were patient. And patience, he realized, often belonged to things that had no reason to rush. Morning came with a pale light, the kind that made everything seem older. Robert rose before dawn and walked to the edge of the hills. From there, he could see the river bend like a silver thread, the ruins dark against the horizon. Somewhere beyond them lay the abandoned abbey Lucien had spoken of. He wondered if the map truly waited there, or if they would find only another layer of stories, each one hiding the next. The choice loomed before him. T. O. Stay was to listen, to gather, To keep building a picture of the past from the fragments the villagers offered Tiogo was to seek the source, to risk the silence that had kept these myths alive. Either way, something had begun to stir, quietly, like the first crack of frost in the soil. The myths were no longer just words in the mouths of elders. They had become questions with weight, and questions, once asked, rarely stayed buried. The castle walls loomed closer as the group pressed on, the cold wind whispering through the narrow gaps in the ancient stones. The night had grown heavier, the stars dim behind a thin veil of mist that rolled over the fields. Eleanor clutched her cloak tighter, feeling a strange pull toward the old ruins ahead. Thomas followed closely, his eyes darting between the path and the distant silhouette of the towers. They had both read the stories, myths, really, of the place, but neither truly believed that anything beyond moss and shadows would greet them there. Yet the air felt different now, charged with something old, something that had been waiting. As they approached, the heavy oak doors creaked open slightly, as if inviting them in, though no one had touched them. "Do you feel that?" Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over the low moan of the wind. Thomas nodded, his jaw tight. There was no sign of life, yet the castle seemed aware, almost awake. Inside, the air was thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke long extinguished. Their lantern flickered across the great hall, revealing faded banners and cracked stone. On the far wall, a tapestry hung half-torn, its threads depicting knights kneeling before a crowned figure with eyes that seemed to follow them. Eleanor reached out, brushing her fingers over the fabric. This looks like the legend of the Black Oath," she murmured. Thomas raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to laugh or to listen. The Black Oath was one of those medieval myth scholars had long dismissed, a tale of knights swearing loyalty to a vanished king in exchange for unnatural power. But recent findings, scattered manuscripts, and old fragments of letters suggested the story might have roots in something real. The air grew colder as they ventured deeper. Their footsteps echoed in the vast silence, until they reached a corridor lined with carved stone faces. Each one was different, each one bearing an expression of pain, joy, or fear. One in particular caught Thomas's eye, a face twisted in anguish, yet the eyes were made of a dark gem that seemed to absorb the lantern's glow. He felt an uneasy tug in his chest, as though the stone itself was watching. Eleanor whispered, "The chronicler we met in the village. He mentioned a passage beneath this hall, a place they called the Room of Truths. They searched until they found the iron ring set into the floor, half hidden beneath a fallen beam. Together, with effort, they pulled it free, revealing a narrow stairway spiraling downward into the dark. The air that wafted up was cold and dry, carrying the scent of earth long undisturbed. "We don't have to go down," Thomas said, but his voice lacked conviction. "If the myth is true, what we find there could change how people see this whole period of history," Eleanor replied. Every historian called it superstition. But what if the myths were warnings? The steps were uneven, slick with age. Their lantern cast thin shadows that stretched like fingers along the walls. Symbols were etched into the stone, circles, runes, and strange animals whose shapes blurred in the low light. As they descended, the sound of their breathing grew louder, their heartbeats a steady drum. At the bottom, they found a low archway leading to a wide chamber. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished, as though they had been carved with care. In the center lay a stone table, upon it a box bound in iron, its surface etched with patterns that shimmered faintly. Eleanor approached slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. She had read about such boxes in obscure medieval records, containers meant to keep something from being lost or perhaps from being found. "Do you think this is it?" she asked, her hand hovering just above the cool iron. Thomas glanced at her, his face tense. The legend said the oath was sealed with an object, something they swore upon. If this is the relic, then it's not just a story anymore. Before they could decide what to do, a faint sound broke the stillness, a whisper like distant voices carried on the draft. They froze, listening. The whispering grew clearer, as though the stones themselves were speaking in an ancient tongue. Eleanor felt a sudden chill down her spine. "Did you hear that?" she breathed. Thomas nodded, but his eyes were on the box. The patterns on its surface seemed to shift, faintly glowing now with a dull, cold light. He reached out and ran his fingers along the edge, and the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, pressing in on them from all sides. "We should leave it," Thomas said suddenly. "Not yet," Eleanor replied. "This could be the proof we've been searching for. The myth of the eternal watch. The pact they said was never broken." Her voice trembled with a mix of fear and fascination. As they stood there, undecided, the ground beneath them seemed to hum faintly. A vibration, subtle but real. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lantern flickered again. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the chamber, a low creak echoed, as if a door had opened. They turned, but the stairway behind them was empty, only the faint draft moving the air. "We're not alone," Thomas whispered. His hand instinctively moved toward the small blade at his side, not for battle, but for reassurance. Eleanor stepped back from the box, her breath coming faster. The myth spoke of guardians, of those who were bound to protect the relic even after death. Some said they were spirits. Others claimed they were men who had never died at all. The light dimmed further, shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. They heard again, the whisper, but now closer, almost between them. The language was unfamiliar, harsh and old, yet something about it stirred a memory in Eleanor's mind. She couldn't place it, but it felt like a warning. She grabbed Thomas's arm. "We have to decide. Do we take it or leave it?" He hesitated, the weight of centuries pressing down on their next choice. Then, a sudden gust of wind blew through the chamber, extinguishing their lantern. Darkness swallowed them whole, and in that darkness, they heard a sound that was neither wind nor stone, a single step, deliberate and slow. Someone or something was in there with them. The nights grew colder as Eleanor found herself walking the same ancient corridors, the flickering torches casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Her mind was restless, unable to ignore the feeling that something was hidden within those thick walls. Each myth she had uncovered felt like a thread leading to something bigger, something that went far beyond the old legends told in marketplaces and monasteries. She thought about the story of the buried crown, the strange symbols carved into the monastery door, and the recurring mention of a figure known only as the Keeper of Secrets. It felt less like random folklore and more like chapters from a larger tale that had been scattered to time. One evening, after hours of poring over manuscripts in the scriptorium, Eleanor heard footsteps behind her. It was Thomas, the historian from a nearby village, who had become an unexpected companion in her search. His knowledge of local families and their oral histories had already proven valuable. "You should see this," he said quietly, holding a brittle parchment that smelled of smoke. It was a letter written centuries ago, describing a night when villagers saw ghostly riders leaving the castle with chests bound in iron. The letter spoke of relics, artifacts that could change the way history itself was remembered. "If this is true," Thomas whispered, "then everything we've believed about this land's past has been carefully shaped, not just recorded." The idea unsettled them both. Could it be that entire chapters of history had been intentionally altered? And if so, by whom? The myths they were uncovering were no longer just old tales. They were keys to something that might explain why certain truths had been hidden. Eleanor began to notice the resistance from the Council of Elders, who had once encouraged her research, but now seemed wary of her findings. Old men with lined faces warned her to leave some stories alone, claiming that not every truth was meant to be dug up. Their sudden caution only made her more determined. In a market square, whispers had already started. People talked about the strange lights seen over the ruined chapel at night, and how livestock would refuse to pass near it after dusk. Some claimed it was the ghost of the last monk who guarded the chapel's vault, a man said to have sworn an oath of silence so deep that even death could not break it. Eleanor visited the site with Thomas one fog-laden morning. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and ancient stone. Inside the chapel ruins, a mosaic floor revealed a faint image, a serpent devouring its own tail, an ancient symbol of cycles and secrets. It was worn, almost erased, but enough remained to stir a chill in her heart. Back in the village, the atmosphere was shifting. Farmers and tradesmen debated whether the old myths were warnings rather than mere tales. Parents kept their children closer at night, and the innkeeper who once told cheerful legends now refused to speak of the past after dark. Thomas collected fragments of stories from travelers, rumors of hidden catacombs, of sealed doors in the mountains that opened only during certain moons, of forgotten oaths sworn by kings and betrayed by heirs. Each tale felt like a puzzle piece, and together they formed a picture that was still missing its most crucial parts. Eleanor's dreams became restless. She saw visions of battles fought under blood-red skies, of hands clutching ancient scrolls while others tried to burn them. In her waking hours, she noticed patterns that had once been invisible. A mural in the monastery that matched an engraving on a farmer's plow, a phrase in an old song that matched the motto on a faded banner in the castle archives. It felt as though the past was trying to speak, but in riddles. The main conflict was no longer about finding a single myth that was true. It was about uncovering why these myths were buried and who had buried them. And as the days passed, Eleanor realized this search could put her at odds with those who wanted the past to remain forgotten. There were subtle warnings, parchments misplaced, doors left unlocked that should have been secured. A messenger who delivered a blank scroll with only a pressed wax seal shaped like the same serpent she saw in the chapel. Someone was watching, and they wanted her to know it. Thomas, too, began to notice strange happenings. His cottage was searched while he was away, yet nothing was stolen. A relic he kept hidden beneath his floorboards, a shard of what he believed to be from a royal scepter, had been moved slightly, as if examined by unseen hands. "It's like the myths are waking people up," he said one evening, "and those who built their power on silence are starting to feel threatened." The villagers grew divided. Some believed Eleanor was on the verge of something great, a chance to bring pride and truth back to their forgotten history. Others feared she would bring only trouble, stirring forces better left alone. A blacksmith warned her, "Legends keep their teeth, even when they grow old. Bite them, and they might bite back." His words haunted her as much as the ancient stories did. One night, as a storm rolled in from the hills, Eleanor received a letter without a sender's name. The paper was damp, the ink smudged, but the message was clear: "Stop before the winter moon. The keeper watches." It was the first time a name appeared outside old manuscripts. Someone alive knew of it and cared enough to warn her. Or was it a threat? The subplots deepened with every day. Thomas discovered a hidden room behind his family's barn, where a wall had been rebuilt centuries ago. Inside, they found wooden chests with faded markings of the royal house, and within them, nothing but sand and a cracked seal bearing the same serpent. A merchant in the village began speaking of a lineage that vanished overnight, a family said to hold the key to a vault beneath the river. And in the monastery, a monk confessed to Eleanor that the archives once held a map too dangerous to show, one that could lead to a treasure that was never gold, but something far more influential: the power to shape belief. The air grew tense, and winter approached. The myths no longer felt like stories. They felt like echoes of a plan, a conflict that never truly ended but lay buried, waiting for someone to stumble upon it. Eleanor began to question her own motives. Was she uncovering the truth for history's sake, or was she part of a much older game? And then, late one night, as the last candle burned low in her study, she heard a knock. Not at the door, but at the window. A figure stood outside in the snow, face hidden by a hood, holding what looked like a fragment of the serpent mosaic. Before she could speak, the figure was gone, leaving only the faint imprint of a boot in the snow, and a sense that the myths she chased had finally started chasing her back. The winter wind pressed against the stone walls of the archive as Eleanor paced the narrow hallway, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The world outside seemed asleep, but inside, something was stirring, something that could change how people viewed the medieval world forever. She had just received a letter, handwritten in dark ink, delivered without a name. It hinted at a connection between the myths they were uncovering and an old monastery hidden deep in the countryside. The letter was unsigned, but a single phrase stood out: "Seek the truth in the stones that remember." It was cryptic, yet somehow familiar, as though the writer knew what they were searching for before they did. Thomas leaned over her shoulder as she read it again. "This can't be a coincidence," he murmured. "The tapestries, the sealed room, the carved stars, they all point to something. And now this." His voice was steady, but Eleanor could hear the underlying tension. He was a man who had walked through battlefields of facts and fiction, who had spent decades teaching history to those who thought it was set in stone. Now that stone was cracking. The group gathered in the small meeting room, a circle of notebooks, digital recorders, and scattered old manuscripts. Jamal read from his notes, tracing the patterns they had found across different regions. Myths once dismissed as rural fantasies seemed to share strange consistencies. Hidden gatherings, secret councils, rituals recorded in the margins of church books. "If even a fraction of this is true," Jamal said, "then we've been ignoring an entire undercurrent of medieval life, one that ran right beneath the eyes of kings, priests, and merchants." Sophia set down a weathered map she had been analyzing for weeks. "This monastery mentioned in the letter," she said quietly. "I've seen it before. It was abandoned after the plague, then used as a refuge during the border wars, but never rebuilt. Local records call it the Abbey of the Listening Stones. People said the stones there could hear prayers and even answer them." Her eyes lingered on the group. It was dismissed as folklore, but maybe that's because no one stayed long enough to ask why. Outside, the snow began to fall heavier, blanketing the streets and muffling the sounds of the city. The team decided to split their tasks. Jamal would dig into the archives for any reference to this abbey. Sophia would cross-reference maps and local legends, and Eleanor would arrange for a visit, though it wouldn't be easy in the heart of winter. As they prepared to leave, a thought lingered among them. What if they were following a path others had tried to bury? That night, Eleanor stayed behind, her fingers tracing the edges of a torn manuscript they had found in the previous week's discovery. It was in poor condition, faded ink, missing pages, but a few lines were still legible. They spoke of stones that remember the voices of the past, and keepers who guard the night of truth. It was not written like a myth, it was a warning. The following days were filled with a growing sense of urgency. Old acquaintances began sending cryptic notes, local historians who once laughed at such tales now sending brief, uneasy messages: "Be careful what you stir." There were whispers that some families had passed down warnings not to disturb the old stones, that a few who tried had suffered inexplicable misfortune. Eleanor brushed it off as superstition, but deep down, something gnawed at her. Were they stepping into history or waking it? On the road to the abbey, the team traveled through quiet villages where time seemed slower, where church bells still marked the hours, and old women watched them pass with unreadable expressions. They stopped at a small inn where the owner, a man in his 70s, served them warm bread and thick stew. When Eleanor mentioned the abbey, his spoon paused midair. "Best left alone," he said simply. "There's stories about that place. Stones that whisper, lights that wander at night. People go there curious, but they come back quieter." Thomas asked him what he meant, but the man only shrugged. "Some stones don't like to be woken," he said, and left them to their meal. By the time they reached the forest path leading to the abbey, the daylight was thin. Branches bent low with the weight of snow, the trail marked only by deer tracks and the occasional crow. The abbey itself appeared suddenly between the trees, its tower leaning slightly, walls scarred by time, but still standing. Moss clung to every surface, and the door was heavy with iron bands. Inside, the air was colder than outside, carrying the faint smell of damp stone and something older, like parchment left too long in a cellar. The team set up their equipment, their lights casting long shadows along the arched hallways. Carved into one of the walls, almost hidden by ivy, were words in Latin: Quat memoria tenet, veritas liberat. Eleanor translated softly, what memory holds, truth frees. Jamal began photographing every inscription, while Sophia documented the layout of the building. Thomas found a side chamber where the floor had partially collapsed, revealing a staircase leading down. It wasn't on any of the maps. They decided to explore it together. The staircase led to a vaulted chamber with shelves carved directly into the stone. Most were empty, but in one, there was a sealed chest, its lid bound with rusted clasps. Next to it lay fragments of parchment and a strange pattern etched into the floor, a circle with lines radiating outward like a star. The chest wouldn't open easily, so they left it for the moment, making careful notes instead. As night deepened, the team gathered by a small fire in one of the intact rooms. Outside, the forest creaked under the weight of the snow. The abbey seemed to hum faintly with the sound of the wind passing through its broken windows. "Do you feel it?" Sophia whispered. "It's like the place is waiting." Eleanor nodded. "The myths we've been chasing, maybe they weren't just stories to keep children entertained. Maybe they were warnings or promises. We don't know which yet." Jamal leaned forward. "And if this chest contains proof? If what's inside rewrites everything we know about this era, we'll have to face the question, why was it hidden? And who hid it?" Their words hung in the cold air, unanswered. Somewhere deep in the abbey, a sound echoed, like a faint whisper carried by stone. They froze, listening, but it came no more. Only the wind remained. The following day, Eleanor found herself walking down a narrow lane that bordered the remnants of an old orchard, the chill morning air carrying the faint scent of damp earth and fallen leaves. A distant church bell tolled, and for a moment, it felt as if the centuries had folded in on themselves. She had agreed to meet Professor Alastair at the edge of the orchard to investigate a newly unearthed site that villagers believed to be linked to one of the oldest myths in the region, the story of a knight who had buried his heart beneath a sacred tree to protect the land. Some said the myth had already been proven true when a relic matching its description was found years ago, while others dismissed it as a coincidence dressed in romantic legend. As they approached the dig, a group of local volunteers greeted them, their boots muddied and their hands calloused from hours of gentle excavation. In the center of the site, a cluster of stones arranged in a circle formed what appeared to be the outline of an ancient shrine. Alastair crouched beside one of the stones, brushing away the soil. "This," he said quietly, "matches a description from the 12th century Chronicle of Arden." The chronicler wrote of a heartstone that marked a knight's vow, one tied to the survival of the nearby village during a time of famine. His voice was calm, but Eleanor could sense his excitement simmering just beneath the surface. The villagers gathered closer, their eyes wide with a mix of reverence and curiosity. For them, this was more than history. It was a thread that tied them to their ancestors. One elderly man, leaning heavily on his cane, spoke up. "My grandfather used to tell me that the land was never to be plowed here because it was hallowed. We thought it was just a story, but now." He let the words hang, as though afraid to break whatever fragile truth they had uncovered. Eleanor felt a surge of responsibility. If they found something truly significant, it would not just rewrite a local legend. It might revive an entire community's connection to its past. As the team continued their careful work, a faint inscription began to emerge on the central stone. The markings were worn but unmistakable, a series of interlaced letters forming a phrase in Old French. Eleanor traced the grooves with her gloved finger, feeling the weight of the centuries pressing back against her touch. "Can you read it?" one of the volunteers asked, his voice hushed. Alastair leaned closer, adjusting his spectacles. "It says, 'For those who come after, may my oath guard the harvest and the hearth.'" There was a pause as the meaning sank in. The myth spoke of a knight who had given up his life to protect his people's prosperity, and now, centuries later, the words of that sacrifice had resurfaced. But as the morning wore on, unease began to creep among the group. Strange patterns had been found beneath the stones, scratches that did not match any known script, and faint discolorations in the soil as though something had once been buried deep below and then taken away. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that part of the story was still hidden, something the chronicler had chosen not to write down. The myth might have been proven true in part, but what about the missing pieces? What had been removed and by whom? And why did the villagers' oldest records speak of famine returning despite the knight's promise? That night, Eleanor sat by the fire in the inn, reviewing her notes by the flickering light. The innkeeper's daughter, a curious girl with a fondness for old tales, approached her. "You know," the girl said, "my grandmother always warned me never to walk near that orchard on nights when the wind blows from the east. She said you could hear a heartbeat in the soil, like the night was still down there, waiting." Eleanor managed a thin smile. Myths had a way of clinging to places like ivy on a wall. They grew with each generation, twining themselves around half-truths and forgotten facts until they became inseparable. The following week, the dig expanded, and with it came more revelations. A small, rusted casket was uncovered at the edge of the shrine, its lock long corroded away. Inside was a fragment of cloth, stained and brittle, along with a seal bearing the emblem of a long-extinct noble house. The seal matched one found in an entirely different part of the country decades earlier, in a monastery known for keeping records of disputed relics. This connection puzzled everyone. How had a relic tied to a southern noble family ended up in a northern orchard? Alastair suspected a hidden network of alliances and secret pacts made during a time of political upheaval, but the details were frustratingly out of reach. As the season turned and autumn leaves began to scatter across the fields, the villagers became both protective and uneasy. They were proud their legend had drawn attention, but they also whispered of strange occurrences at night. Footsteps in the orchard, lantern lights where no one was supposed to be, and faint, hollow sounds beneath the earth. Some said it was just the wind stirring the roots of the old trees, but others began to worry that disturbing the sight had awakened something that preferred to remain buried. Eleanor received a letter one evening, sealed with wax that bore no modern stamp. Inside was a single line, written in a hurried, slanted hand. "You are searching in the wrong place." The heart was never buried to bless the land. It was buried to hide a name. There was no signature, only a faint scent of old parchment. She showed it to Alastair, who read it twice before folding it carefully back into the envelope. "If that's true," he murmured, "then everything we thought we knew about this myth is turned inside out." It wasn't a blessing. It was a seal. The discovery changed their perspective. They began to look at the markings again, this time searching not for messages of protection, but for warnings disguised as vows. The knight might not have been a selfless protector, but a keeper of something far more dangerous. The villagers' oldest tales mentioned years of peace, followed by years of inexplicable misfortune, as though the blessing only held as long as the secret remained intact. Now, with the stones unearthed and the stories brought back to light, the question lingered: what exactly had they disturbed? Eleanor could feel the tension in the village growing with each passing day. Farmers crossed themselves when they passed the orchard, and the children, once curious and bold, now avoided it altogether. Even the air felt heavier, as if carrying a memory too old to name. And yet, she could not bring herself to stop the work. To turn away now would mean leaving the truth half-buried, the myth forever twisted into a half-remembered comfort. Somewhere in the soil lay the other half of the story, and she was determined to uncover it, even if it meant facing whatever the night had sought to hide. The night before their final expedition, Eleanor sat beside a low fire, staring into the dancing flames that cracked and hissed with each snap of burning wood. The forest was silent except for the wind pressing against the tent walls, carrying with it the chill of a distant storm. She could feel the weight of what they were about to uncover, centuries of forgotten truths, myths once ridiculed and dismissed, now showing their teeth in the dim glow of rediscovery. Marcus paced nearby, clutching the edge of his cloak, muttering over old notes and sketches that had become their lifeline. His excitement was edged with unease, as though he sensed that once they crossed the final threshold, there would be no turning back. The villagers had warned them about the ruins ahead, speaking in hushed voices as though the stones themselves might be listening. They said the walls whispered at night, that those who stepped too far inside never returned quite the same. At first, Eleanor dismissed their fears as remnants of a superstitious age, but after the strange echoes in the valley and the shadows that seemed to move where no one walked, she could no longer shrug them off so easily. Myths had already proven themselves real in ways she never expected. Who was to say what else lingered just out of sight? As dawn approached, a pale light washed over the distant hills, and the landscape seemed to hold its breath. The ruins emerged from the fog like the spine of some ancient beast, jagged stones reaching toward the sky, blackened with time. Each step toward them felt heavier than the last. The closer they came, the more the air seemed to shift, cooler, denser, carrying a low hum that neither of them could explain. Marcus glanced at Eleanor, and for the first time, she saw doubt flicker across his face. Inside, the carvings were unlike any they had documented before. They told stories in fragmented images. Kings kneeling before strange lights in the sky, warriors vanishing into forests only to return decades later unchanged, and circles of hooded figures marking the stars with patterns eerily similar to modern maps. One wall depicted a figure with outstretched hands, surrounded by both villagers and creatures that no scholar had yet placed in any known bestiary. The colors had faded, but the message pulsed with something alive, something that didn't want to be forgotten. Marcus reached out to trace the edge of symbol, but Eleanor stopped him. "Not yet," she whispered. It wasn't fear of breaking it. It was the sense that they were being watched, weighed somehow. The myths they had been chasing were not merely stories. They were warnings, and the deeper they went, the more the walls seemed to whisper those warnings in the language of the stones. Outside, clouds began to gather, thick and rolling, turning the morning to dusk. Birds had vanished from the treetops. The usual sounds of the forest, the rustle of small animals, the distant rush of a stream, were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness that pressed against their ears. They lit their lanterns and pressed on, deeper into the heart of the ruin, where a narrow passage wound downward into darkness. Here the air changed again, metallic and cold, carrying a scent like damp earth and iron. The passage opened into a vast chamber where the ceiling soared high above, lost in shadow. At the center stood a stone table, its surface covered in runes they had only seen in fragments before. This was older than the castle walls, older than the village, perhaps older than the kingdom itself. Marcus's voice was barely a whisper as he read the first line aloud, his breath fogging in the chill air. They waited in the dark, and when the time came, they woke the stones. Eleanor felt her skin prickle. The myths of the waking stones had always been told as children's tales, rocks that rose at night to wander the hills, markers that shifted when no one was looking. Farmers spoke of them, travelers feared them, and historians laughed. But now, standing in this place, with the stones humming faintly under their fingers, the laughter seemed distant and hollow. The chamber trembled, ever so slightly, as if acknowledging their presence. Dust fell from the ceiling in soft streams, catching the lantern light like drifting snow. Marcus took a step back, glancing around the walls. Each one bore a fragment of a map, pieces of a larger world long lost, and at its center was the name of a forgotten city, the same one mentioned in the royal archives as a place that vanished overnight, leaving only rumors of fire and curses behind. They began to piece it together. The myths of the waking stones, the eternal storms, the guardians of the gate, they were not separate tales. They were chapters of the same story, scattered across generations, told in fragments to keep their memory alive without ever revealing too much. Someone, or something, wanted these stories hidden, yet kept alive just enough to be feared. Eleanor pulled out her journal and sketched the markings, her hand shaking slightly. The symbols matched those found on a relic unearthed far to the north, a place where the ground had been frozen for centuries. How could two sites so distant share the same language, the same warnings? Were these myths not just regional curiosities, but part of a network that spanned the old world, connecting places and people long before written history claimed to begin. A sound broke the silence, a slow, dragging noise from the far corner of the chamber. Both froze. Their lanterns swung toward the sound, catching only the ripple of a shadow slipping behind a broken column. Eleanor called out softly, but no voice answered. Marcus gripped the lantern tighter, his jaw tense. They had been warned that the ruins were never truly empty, that sometimes myths left behind more than just stories. The noise came again, closer this time. It was neither fully human nor animal, more like stone grating against stone, accompanied by a low vibration that rattled in their bones. The lantern flickered, and for an instant, the runes on the table glowed faintly, as though catching a hidden breath of light. They exchanged a glance, one that carried both fear and unspoken resolve. They had come too far to turn back now, yet each step deeper felt like walking along the edge of a blade. The myths had led them here, with promises of truth, but truth had its own price, and sometimes it asked more than either history or faith was willing to give. As they pressed further into the chamber, the air grew colder, and the humming grew louder. The walls began to shift, not physically, but in how they appeared, their carvings seeming to rearrange when the lantern light danced across them. What had once been simple shapes now resembled faces, eyes watching from the stone. It was then Eleanor realized the oldest myth of all might have been the most accurate, that history was not merely remembered by people, but by the earth itself, and that it had ways of showing its memory when the right questions were asked. Outside, the storm finally broke. Rain hammered the stones above, and the wind roared through the hollow ruins, echoing down into the depths. The sound masked the strange movement in the dark, the quiet shift of something ancient waking just beyond the edge of their vision. The night had turned cold, the kind of chill that crept into the bones and lingered. Alan walked the narrow streets with a lantern in hand, its dim glow flickering against the stone walls that seemed to lean inward as though they carried secrets. Somewhere behind him, distant footsteps echoed and then faded. He did not turn around, but his grip on the handle tightened. The air carried the faint sound of a church bell far away, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the world itself was holding its breath. He reached the edge of the village square where the old fountain stood, its water frozen into jagged layers. Isabel was already there, cloaked and hooded, her eyes darting across the shadows as if each corner might suddenly reveal what they were chasing. She held a parchment tightly rolled, its edges frayed from the many times she had opened and closed it. "I found something," she whispered. "A monk's record, not from the church we visited, but from a hidden archive in the monastery ruins." Alan's eyes flickered with a quiet determination. "Does it confirm the myth?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It confirms that they believed in something real enough to hide, something they feared." The moonlight revealed her trembling fingers as she passed the parchment to him. It spoke of a chest sealed beneath the abbey crypt, a chest that monks swore contained relics of a figure who walked the earth long before their time, a figure said to rise during the years of famine and war. It sounded like a tale meant to frighten peasants into obedience, yet the more Alan read, the more he sensed a pattern. The times described matched the very upheavals that had shaped kingdoms, toppled lords, and rewritten histories. "If this is true," he murmured, "then every myth they called a lie may have been a warning." Meanwhile, Thomas lingered by the well, his torch lowered as he watched them from a distance. He had been sent to report back to the Lord's Hall, but something in his gut told him leaving now would mean missing the moment everything turned. The snow crunched under his boots as he inched closer, careful not to be seen. The villagers spoke often of cursed winters and of the silent watchers in the hills, and he had always laughed it off. But tonight, as the stars seemed to vanish behind creeping clouds, he wasn't sure what to believe anymore. From the far side of the square, a low sound echoed, with shifting, iron dragging across stone. Alan and Isabel both froze. The blacksmith shop door, which had been shut, now stood slightly ajar, its hinges groaning against the wind. No one was inside. Or, at least, no one should have been. Alan exchanged a look with Isabel, then slowly stepped toward the door. "It's too late for the forge to be open," he whispered. She nodded. "Or too early for the day to begin," she replied, her voice barely audible. As they entered, the air smelled faintly of soot and something older, like damp parchment left to rot. Tools hung on the walls, their outlines sharp against the dim glow of the lantern. On the workbench lay a crude carving of a figure, hooded, faceless, and holding a staff marked with strange runes. Isabel's breath caught. "This symbol," she whispered, tracing the mark with her finger. "It's the same as the one on the monastery's gate." Alan frowned. So the blacksmith knew? Or someone wanted him to leave a sign? Suddenly, the shutters slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass. The lantern flickered violently, throwing their shadows against the wall like monstrous shapes. For a heartbeat, they heard a whisper, though neither could say from where it came. It spoke in the old tongue, the one Alan had seen only in fragments in the archives. Isabel grabbed his sleeve. "Did you hear that?" she asked. He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the carving, which now seemed to glisten, as though damp with fresh ink. Thomas burst in a moment later, his face pale. "The riders are coming," he hissed. "Not from the Lord's Hall, from the woods." They stepped outside to see faint lights weaving through the trees, torches, too many to count, moving in silence. No horses, no banners, only the glow of fire snaking closer. "We need to leave," Isabel said, her voice steady but urgent. Alan nodded, but his gaze lingered on the square, on the fountain, on the very stones beneath their feet. Something beneath them had been buried, and now it felt as though the earth itself wanted it to rise. The villagers began to shutter their windows. Somewhere a dog barked, then whimpered into silence. The wind carried the smell of burning pine, though no fire had yet reached the village. They ran toward the chapel, its doors heavy and cold. Inside, the air was thick with candle smoke and dust. The altar stood draped in crimson cloth, and beneath it, a hollow in the stone seemed disturbed, as if recently opened. Isabel knelt, brushing her hands across the edge. "They were here," she whispered. "Not long ago." Alan crouched beside her, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Who?" he asked. Her reply was barely a whisper. "The ones who keep the myths alive." She held up a sliver of bone, carved with the same rune they had seen on the carving. His stomach turned. "This isn't just a story," he said. "It's a warning." Outside, the torches drew nearer, the lights now circling the square like a silent siege. The villagers dared not look. Doors locked, curtains drawn. In the distance, a horn sounded, a long, low call that did not belong to any army they knew. Alan looked at Isabel, then at Thomas, whose hand gripped the hilt of his sword though his arm trembled. "Whatever is coming," Alan said quietly. "It was meant to be forgotten, and now it's here." As the night deepened, snow began to fall, soft but relentless. The sound of the horn faded, replaced by a stillness so complete it made every breath feel too loud. Somewhere in that silence, they knew a choice was being forced upon them: stay and face what the myths had warned, or flee and carry the secret into the world beyond. Neither option promised safety. Both promised truth. The night felt heavier than usual as Marcus, Eleanor, and the historian continued their pursuit of the medieval truth that had been eluding them for weeks. The village streets had emptied, but the echoes of their discoveries lingered in their minds, weaving a tapestry of myths that were no longer just tales. They were becoming tangible threads of history. Marcus found himself glancing at the old journal they had been using as a guide, the ink fading yet stubbornly alive, as though each word had been placed there knowing it would one day resurface. The myths about lost relics, vanished cities, and secret alliances were no longer whispers of imagination. They were turning into a map that led to something bigger, something powerful enough to reshape what people believed about the medieval world. Eleanor, her mind a storm of thoughts, replayed the moments they had uncovered proof that an old monastery's chronicler had been secretly documenting truths that the powerful wanted hidden. The burning of archives centuries ago had been no accident. It was an erasure of inconvenient truths. Why were these myths so threatening back then? Why would leaders prefer that the world forget tales of peasants who rose with unexpected courage or merchants who shaped empires quietly behind the throne? The closer they came to understanding, the more the story unfolded into something larger than forgotten legends. It hinted at a pattern, a deliberate rewriting of history. The historian's words from earlier still hung in the cold air. Sometimes the greatest myth is the one people are taught to believe without question. He believed that what they were chasing was not just a single story, but an entire chapter of history that had been pushed into the shadows. There were mentions of a brotherhood, guardians who had taken it upon themselves to carry the truth across generations, embedding it within myths so it could not be destroyed entirely. If that were true, then somewhere out there, pieces of the puzzle had survived in ways no one had thought to look. They had followed a trail to an ancient stone bridge said to mark the path of a long-lost pilgrimage. The myth claimed travelers who crossed it at dawn would see visions of the past etched into the fog. Marcus thought it was nonsense until the historian pointed to faint carvings along the railing, covered by lichen and time. Symbols of forgotten houses, obscure crests, and a date long erased from official records. It was there they found their next clue, a phrase barely readable: "Truth waits where shadow lingers." The discovery unsettled them. If this was indeed a breadcrumb left by the Brotherhood, what were they supposed to do next? The phrase felt like both a warning and an invitation. As they lingered by the bridge, the cold wind carried the distant sound of a bell. No churches had rung for hours. The historian urged them to move quickly, suggesting the bell might not be a coincidence. Eleanor hesitated. She had read enough to know that myths often had guardians of their own, not all of them willing to see the truth brought into daylight. As they moved toward the old quarter of the city, their path lit only by flickering street lamps, Marcus couldn't shake the growing sense that they were being watched. Shadows seemed to shift unnaturally against the walls. It was the same feeling he had in the archives when the candles flickered out by themselves. These weren't just old tales they were uncovering. Someone or something was ensuring those tales remained buried. But why? And who would benefit from keeping these myths locked away? In the dim light of the historian's study, they gathered once more to piece together the fragments. Each myth they had verified so far: knights who disobeyed orders to protect villages, healers accused of sorcery who had in fact pioneered medicine, alliances between rivals that shaped trade routes, painted a picture of a medieval world far more complex than the clean lines history books often suggested. These weren't just side stories. They were truths that challenged the official version of events. Eleanor brought up the sealed scroll they hadn't dared to open yet. It was found beneath a chapel floor, its wax seal bearing a crest no modern historian had seen. Breaking it felt like crossing a line, but leaving it sealed meant staying in the dark. Marcus argued they should open it now, before the trail went cold. The historian, however, warned that whatever was inside might put them in danger. Not in a mythical way, but in a very real, present way. There were still people, he said, who had reasons to keep the past quiet. The tension between them grew as the night deepened. Eleanor felt torn between fear and responsibility. Every step they took brought them closer to something that felt both historic and forbidden. The more they learned, the more they realized that these myths, once dismissed as colorful stories, had been a form of resistance, a way for the voiceless to keep their truth alive through coded tales. But resistance to what? And what power still feared those voices after centuries had passed? The sealed scroll remained on the table, its presence commanding the room. Marcus's hand hovered near it more than once, but he stopped each time, glancing at Eleanor and the historian. They were standing at the edge of something they didn't yet fully understand. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and a distant howl broke the stillness, echoing off the cobblestones like a warning. Somewhere out there, the past was waiting, alive, restless, and unwilling to stay buried. The night ended without them opening the scroll. Instead, they hid it again, this time in a safer place, marked only by a small etching beneath the desk. As they stepped outside, the historian whispered, "The myths are not the danger. It's the silence around them." His words carried the weight of centuries. Eleanor looked up at the stars, wondering how many of them had witnessed the same truths, the same cover-ups, the same cycles of myth and memory. Tomorrow, they would travel further east, to a place the bridge's inscription hinted at, an abandoned fortress, now nothing more than ruins on a cliffside, where the Brotherhood was said to have gathered before vanishing from history. It was there, they believed, the next piece of the puzzle waited. But they also knew each step closer meant stirring forces that had remained undisturbed for generations. The city behind them slept, unaware that its quiet streets had once been the stage for forgotten heroes, betrayed alliances, and whispered rebellions. The myths were not just coming to life, they were demanding to be heard. And for Marcus, Eleanor, and the historian, turning away was no longer an option, even as the night's shadows thickened around them and the line between legend and reality grew ever thinner. The night felt colder than usual, though the weather hadn't changed. It was the weight of what was unfolding that chilled the air around them. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that the pieces of the puzzle were far more tangled than anyone had imagined. Every lead they followed seemed to circle back to the same handful of names, but those names never stayed fixed. They shifted like smoke in the wind, leaving only traces that hinted at a larger, hidden structure at play. His team worked tirelessly, piecing together old records, security logs, and whispered testimonies from people too afraid to speak openly. And yet, the closer they got, the more the truth seemed to resist them. It was around midnight when the second twist began to take shape, not as a loud revelation, but as a quiet anomaly that refused to be ignored. Maria called Daniel over, her voice steady but tinged with unease. She had been cross-referencing archive case files with recently accessed databases when she stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist, a hidden communication channel running through an old, forgotten server. It wasn't just old. It was obsolete by modern standards, a relic buried in the shadows of the agency's infrastructure. But it was still active, and it had been transmitting encrypted messages for years without anyone noticing. Daniel stared at the lines of code on the screen. The timestamps stretched back decades, far longer than the current investigation, and some of the earliest entries coincided with unsolved incidents that had long been deemed unrelated. It was as though someone had been curating the narrative all along, feeding just enough information to mislead, while hiding the core of the operation in plain sight. The messages weren't random. They were directives, orders, and some were recent. The discovery unsettled everyone. If the channel had been there this long, it meant the network they were chasing wasn't just surviving, it was embedded, layered, and shielded by people who understood how to keep secrets buried deep. And if the recent transmissions were connected to their case, it meant someone within the system still had their hands on the levers. As the team dug deeper, they realized this wasn't just about one suspect or one event. It was a web. Several individuals they had been tracking were suddenly linked by subtle, deliberate movements, unrecorded transfers, inexplicable travel logs, and shared access to restricted areas. The data formed a lattice of connections that spanned borders, pulling in people from law enforcement, corporate sectors, and even obscure research divisions. Each thread they pulled revealed another, and with every layer they peeled back, the sense of urgency grew. Meanwhile, on the streets, whispers began to surface. Witnesses who had remained silent out of fear started dropping hints to investigative journalists, hinting that what was being uncovered wasn't just corruption. It was an organized effort to manipulate outcomes, to control narratives, to erase certain people from the record entirely. One particularly anxious source handed over a battered notebook filled with scribbled notes and cryptic symbols. It mentioned names Daniel had seen in the transmissions and hinted at a project that had been quietly restarted after being shut down decades ago. Maria and Daniel met with the source in a dimly lit parking garage, the only place the whistleblower felt remotely safe. Their hands trembled as they spoke, constantly scanning the shadows as if expecting someone to step out at any moment. They warned that the real danger wasn't in the individuals they had already identified. It was in the ones still hidden, the ones orchestrating from behind layers of deniability. They mentioned a date, coming soon, and said that if the team didn't act before then, something irreversible would be set into motion. This revelation hit hard. It wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. It was a countdown, and time was slipping away. Back at headquarters, tensions rose. Some team members questioned whether they had the authority or the resources to pursue this new lead without official sanction. Others argued that waiting for permission was exactly what the network was counting on. Internal disagreements flared, creating fractures within the group just when they needed unity most. The deeper they went, the more they realized how easily doubt could be weaponized against them. Daniel tried to hold the team together, but even he wasn't immune to the strain. Late at night, alone in his office, he replayed the whistleblower's words, the urgency in their voice, the fear in their eyes. Something about that notebook felt personal, as though it wasn't just a warning. It was a confession from someone who had once been part of it, now trying to make things right before it was too late. As they prepared their next steps, they noticed a disturbing pattern. Surveillance equipment at their safe locations had been tampered with. Cameras were looping old footage. Logs were missing or rewritten. Someone was watching them as closely as they were watching the suspects. The realization settled over them like a heavy fog. This wasn't just a chase anymore. It was a duel in the dark, each side trying to stay a step ahead, each misstep potentially fatal to the investigation. And then came the twist no one saw coming. A name appeared in the transmissions that should have been impossible, one of their own. Someone inside their circle, someone they had trusted for months, had been in contact with the hidden network all along. The evidence wasn't enough to confront them outright. Not yet, but it was enough to change everything. Every conversation now felt like a risk, every plan like a potential trap. Daniel chose silence. He said nothing to the team, not yet. He needed proof, and more than that, he needed to know how deep the betrayal went. But the knowledge burned in his chest, changing the way he looked at every interaction, every casual exchange of words. Trust, once their strongest bond, now felt like a liability. The second plot twist had arrived not as an explosion, but as a slow, creeping fracture. The stakes were higher, the clock was ticking faster, and the line between ally and adversary had blurred beyond recognition. Whatever was waiting for them on that date the whistleblower mentioned, it wasn't just a single event. It was a turning point that could redefine everything they thought they knew. The city had started to feel like a stage where everyone was playing a part, and yet no one knew the full script. Whispers in alleyways, quiet exchanges in coffee shops, and small hints buried in stacks of reports suggested there was far more at play than a single case or a single mistake. People who once appeared trustworthy were now showing cracks in their armor. Rebecca noticed how easily certain files disappeared, how sudden budget reassignments shifted focus away from crucial evidence, and how individuals who asked too many questions suddenly grew silent, as if they had been warned or bought. The streets seemed to carry that same tension. Neighbors glancing over shoulders, hushed conversations cut short when footsteps approached. It wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a pressure building quietly, waiting for the right moment to break. Navarro had been spending more time with contacts who operated outside traditional circles, journalists, retired investigators, even a few reluctant insiders. One night, he met a man in a dimly lit garage on the edge of town, someone who claimed to have worked with an internal unit years ago. The man spoke in vague terms at first, but as trust was cautiously exchanged, a new piece of the puzzle emerged, a shadow directive that had been buried, one that linked not only past disappearances, but also several unexplained transfers of personnel and classified funding. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to keep Navarro awake long after the meeting, the city's skyline dark against the night as his mind pieced together the implications. Someone had been pulling strings for years, shaping events quietly while the public saw only fragments of the truth. Meanwhile, the community itself was starting to notice the tension in subtle ways. A shop owner who had always welcomed familiar faces now kept his store closed earlier than usual. A teacher whispered that her students spoke about strange cars parked near their neighborhood for hours at a time. It wasn't just paranoia, it was a pattern of quiet observation, a network of watching eyes that felt too organized to be coincidence. Rebecca began documenting these accounts, filling page after page with small details that, on their own, meant little, but together hinted at something coordinated and deliberate. It felt like standing in the shadow of something massive, its edges just out of sight. Amidst this, the second twist began to surface, not through confrontation, but through a quiet, almost accidental discovery. Navarro had been reviewing old footage from a case thought to be unrelated when he spotted a familiar emblem, a symbol that matched one found on a confidential envelope they had received weeks ago. It was subtle, almost hidden in the corner of a frame, but it connected two separate threads that had been running parallel all this time. This symbol was tied to a contractor often cited in past investigations, one that was always mentioned but never fully explained. It meant someone had been closer to their work than they imagined, perhaps even using them as a shield to divert attention from a deeper operation. This realization changed how they moved. Every phone call became measured, every meeting planned in places where no one would suspect. They started communicating through written notes rather than texts, aware that their usual methods were likely being watched. The sense of escalation wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet tightening of the net around them. Friends who once offered help now hesitated, unsure which side of the line was safe anymore. Trust became a rare commodity, and both Rebecca and Navarro felt its absence with each passing day. At the same time, another layer of the conflict unfolded. A key witness, long presumed missing or unwilling to cooperate, resurfaced under a different name, working quietly in a remote facility outside the city. This person had information that tied several unexplained movements together, but their sudden reappearance raised even more questions. Why now? Who had hidden them? And most importantly, what forced them to step back into the open after all this time? When Rebecca managed to meet this individual briefly, their words were fragmented, cautious, as though they feared every syllable would trigger unseen consequences. They spoke of a deal that had been made, one that went terribly wrong, and hinted at a single name that both agents had heard before, though never in a context this dark. The investigation took on a heavier tone after that. They were no longer chasing ghosts from the past. They were walking in the present shadows of a force that had always been a step ahead. Files continued to vanish, calls went unanswered, and an official report surfaced trying to discredit their earlier findings. It painted their suspicions as exaggerated, their pursuit as reckless. But the timing was too convenient, the wording too precise, as if designed to sway public opinion just enough to make them doubt themselves. Still, they pressed on, unwilling to let carefully planted narratives rewrite what they had already uncovered. The second twist also rippled through their personal lives. Friends asked why they looked over their shoulders so often now. Family members called late at night, sensing something had shifted but never getting a clear answer. It became a delicate balance of protecting the people closest to them without revealing too much, without dragging them into a storm that was growing far beyond a single case. Sleep was rare, and when it came, it was shallow, restless, interrupted by the lingering thought that each day might bring another disappearance. This time not of a stranger, but of someone standing too close to the truth. Each lead now felt like a race against an invisible clock. They found more fragments, invoices tied to unmarked vehicles, coded correspondences hidden in routine reports, and names that reappeared at the edges of multiple incidents across different years. It became clear this wasn't isolated. It was systemic. The scale of it was staggering, but the proof remained scattered, fragile, like glass ready to shatter at the slightest pressure. The conflict had grown into something far larger than their initial mission, and yet it was still personal, because every step forward risked drawing a line that could not be erased. The stakes were no longer just professional reputations or closed cases. It was about exposure, pulling a thread that might unravel an entire fabric carefully woven over decades. Navarro once said, in a quiet moment over coffee, that it felt like being part of a story where the ending had already been written by someone else. Rebecca didn't respond, but she knew he was right. The moves felt preordained, as though they were being allowed just enough freedom to believe they were making progress, while the real decisions were being made far away, in rooms without windows. And yet, there was no turning back. The escalation had already begun, the second twist had forced their hand, and now each decision carried more weight than the one before. They weren't just chasing answers anymore. They were trying to stay one step ahead of a force that thrived in the silence, in the gaps between the known and the hidden. And somewhere in those gaps, the next move was already being planned. The night felt like it was holding its breath. The city streets, once buzzing with noise and hurried footsteps, now seemed frozen under the pale glow of the streetlights. Rebecca's hands were tight on the wheel as she turned the final corner, her heart pounding so hard it echoed in her ears. Navarro sat beside her, scanning the sidewalks, his jaw tight, his eyes darting to every shadow. They had followed the clues, pieced together fragments of truth, and chased down the names that no one wanted to speak out loud. Everything had led here, but even now, neither of them could predict what would happen once they stepped inside. The building was old, its bricks cracked with age, its windows dark as if the night had swallowed the light whole. They moved silently, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air. As they reached the entrance, the door swung open, and a faint light spilled out, flickering like a dying candle. Inside, the room stretched into a maze of corridors lined with photographs, documents, and maps pinned to the walls. The faces staring back at them were the same ones they had seen scattered across their investigation. Victims, witnesses, even officers who had quietly vanished without a word. At the far end of the room stood a man, his back to them, his shoulders stiff. Rebecca recognized the silhouette immediately. It was Jeremy, the same man they had been told was long gone, the same name that kept reappearing like a ghost in their files. He turned slowly, and his face looked exactly as it had in the old photographs, untouched by time. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, as if reality itself had slipped. Navarro's breath caught, and Rebecca felt her grip tighten around her flashlight. Jeremy's voice was calm, almost too calm. "You've come a long way," he said, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "But you still don't understand, do you?" His words cut through the silence, each one heavy with something unspoken. He gestured toward the walls, the photos, the web of lines connecting faces and places. "This isn't about one case. It never was. It's about all of them." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice steady though her chest was tight. "Then explain it. Tell us what this is before more people disappear." But Jeremy only smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. "You think they disappeared because of me?" he asked, his tone somewhere between disbelief and pity. "No, they disappeared because they got too close to the truth. Just like you." Navarro shifted his weight, his hand brushing against the edge of his jacket, ready for whatever might come next. "And what truth is that?" he asked. Jeremy's expression darkened, and for the first time, the calm cracked. "The truth is that this has been happening for decades, long before either of you put on a badge. There are places out there, places no map will ever show, where names like yours are written down long before you ever arrive." His gaze locked on Rebecca. "You're not chasing me. You're following the trail they left behind." The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, as Jeremy stepped closer. For a moment, Rebecca thought he might lunge or flee, but instead, he slid a small file across the table. "This is what you wanted, isn't it?" he said. "Proof. But proof comes with a cost." Rebecca opened the file, her fingers trembling. Inside were photos, fresh ones. The same boy they had seen in older files, Subject 12, standing in places that shouldn't exist, his eyes hauntingly empty, his presence unchanged despite the decades that had passed. And there, in the corner of one photo, was someone else, a man in uniform, one of their own. The date stamped in the corner was only 2 weeks ago. Navarro let out a slow breath, his mind racing. "This can't be real," he whispered. It means you've been looking in the wrong direction." Jeremy interrupted. "They don't want you to stop me. They want you to find me, so you never see them." Before they could respond, a sound echoed through the building, a low, mechanical hum growing louder, closer. Jeremy's face shifted, and for the first time, there was something like fear in his eyes. "They're here," he said, his voice low. "You brought them faster than I expected." Rebecca spun around, her flashlight cutting across the walls. The lights began to flicker, the hum turning into a high-pitched whine that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Navarro grabbed her arm. "We need to move," he said, his voice tight. Jeremy stepped back into the shadows, his outline fading against the wall of faces. "You wanted the truth," he called out. "Now you'll have to decide what to do with it." The door slammed shut, and the room was plunged into darkness. The only sound left was the hum, now joined by a faint, rhythmic pounding, like footsteps, dozens of them, approaching fast. Rebecca clutched the file to her chest, her heartbeat racing as her mind tried to catch up. There was no turning back now. Everything they had uncovered had led to this moment, and yet it felt like they were standing on the edge of something far bigger, something that had been waiting for them all along. The lights flickered once more, revealing a figure at the end of the hall, a child's silhouette, still, silent, watching. And then the lights went out again. The courtroom was silent, except for the echo of footsteps as Navarro approached the witness stand. The defense attorney had just sat down, a smug look on his face, believing he had cornered the prosecution. But Navarro carried something that shifted the air entirely, a piece of evidence that had been hidden until now. The projector flickered to life, and the screen behind the judge lit up with an image everyone had been waiting for, but no one expected to see. It wasn't just a photograph. It was a time-stamped video showing George meeting in a dimly lit garage with a figure the investigation had never publicly identified. The grainy footage caught the man's face as he turned toward the camera, his features unmistakable to anyone who had followed the case. It was the same person who had sworn under oath that he had no contact with George before the night of the incident. Gasps rippled through the room like a wave. Rebecca stood at the back of the courtroom, watching the ripple effect of realization cross the jury's faces. It wasn't just about George anymore. It was about the network behind him, the people who had pushed events in the shadows, manipulating both law enforcement and public perception. The climax was no longer a single man's fall. It was the collapse of a carefully built facade. The prosecutor's voice trembled slightly as he explained how the footage had been uncovered, hidden in an encrypted drive that one of George's former associates had turned over at the last minute, fearing he might become the next name on a list no one wanted to be on. George shifted in his seat, his hands clenching the table, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. But for the first time since the trial began, George looked truly cornered, not by accusation, but by undeniable evidence. His carefully rehearsed calm cracked, his jaw tightening as he glared at the screen. Navarro caught that look and knew it wasn't just anger. It was recognition. Someone had betrayed him, someone close enough to know his every move. And if that betrayal had reached the courtroom, it meant the web they were pulling was far larger than they had imagined. Outside the courthouse, reporters scrambled to broadcast the revelation. Crowds gathered, murmuring about how deep the corruption went and what other secrets were still buried. Rebecca stepped out briefly, the cold air biting her face as she looked over the city that had become the stage for this storm. She knew this wasn't over, not even close. The footage was a key, but keys only opened doors, and behind this one, there would be more rooms, more corridors, more shadows to walk through. Inside, the judge called for order as the defense tried to object, claiming the evidence was obtained too late and under questionable circumstances. But the jury had seen enough. They leaned forward, whispering among themselves, their expressions shifting from doubt to determination. The tension in the room became almost unbearable, every second stretching longer than the last. Then came the twist no one saw coming. As the court recessed for the day, a message appeared on Navarro's phone, an anonymous tip sent through a secure channel he had set up months ago. The message was simple. The footage you showed is only part of it. Meet me tonight. There's more you need to know. Don't bring anyone. Attached was a still image, a warehouse on the edge of town, abandoned for years, but now apparently alive with secrets. Navarro stared at the message, torn between the need to follow procedure and the knowledge that waiting could mean losing the only chance to pull the thread further. Rebecca found him outside, his face pale with the weight of decision. She didn't ask what was in the message. She could read it in his eyes. "You're not going alone," she said quietly. "If they wanted you dead, they wouldn't send a warning." Her voice was calm, but beneath it, there was something else, resolve mixed with unease. They both knew this was the point where the story could either end with a full picture or spiral into something far darker. Night fell over the city like a slow curtain, the streets emptying as they drove toward the warehouse. The closer they got, the more Navarro felt the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing on his chest. The trial, the footage, the names whispered in backrooms. It all pointed here to a forgotten place on the edge of town where answers were waiting. Or maybe a trap. The warehouse loomed against the horizon, its windows dark, its doors chained but not locked. They stepped inside, flashlights cutting through the dust and decay. The air smelled of rust and oil, of old secrets kept too long. Then a figure stepped from the shadows, hood drawn over his face. He tossed a small drive toward them. It slid across the floor, stopping at Rebecca's feet. "That's the rest of it," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "But you didn't hear it from me. They're already watching you." Before Navarro could ask who they were, the man vanished into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of his warning. The drive in Rebecca's hand felt heavier than it should have been. They didn't plug it in there, not yet. Some truths needed the right place, the right moment to come alight. Back at their safe house, they loaded the contents. What they found wasn't just about George. It was about a system built to protect men like him, a network of influence that stretched far beyond their city. Names scrolled across the screen, politicians, officers, even people they had trusted. The climax wasn't the trial. The trial was just the opening act. The real fight was still ahead. And then the final twist hit. One of the names on the list was someone Navarro had known for years. Someone he had trusted more than most. The kind of name that made your blood run cold when you saw it in a place it should never have been. Rebecca saw his face as he read it, and she understood without a word. The story had come full circle, but the circle was bigger than either of them imagined. The crowd outside the station had started to thin by the time the investigation's final report was made public. Those who remained stood quietly, some with folded arms, others holding their breath as the chief stepped forward to speak. He didn't deliver a dramatic speech, nor did he attempt to spin the events that had shaken their small town. Instead, he spoke plainly about what had gone wrong, how it had been allowed to go wrong for so long, and what they planned to do to make sure it didn't happen again. There was a somber honesty in his voice, one that made even the most skeptical residents pause and listen. It wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about rebuilding something that had been cracked at its very core. Navarro stood near the back of the gathering, his hands in his pockets, watching the faces around him. He wasn't looking for applause or recognition. He was looking for signs that people still believed in the system, that they hadn't lost faith completely. Rebecca joined him quietly, her eyes tired but calmer than they had been in days. They had done their part, but they knew this was only the beginning of a longer process. The investigation had exposed more than just misconduct. It had revealed gaps in oversight, cracks in communication, and how quickly trust could unravel when those in power turn away from their responsibility. As the last questions were answered and the small crowd began to drift away, families lingered on the edges, talking softly among themselves. Some spoke of forgiveness, some of anger, but there was a common thread, relief that the truth had come out. One elderly man approached Navarro, his hat clutched tightly in his hand, and said he hoped the younger officers would learn from this, not to fear accountability, but to embrace it as part of their duty. Navarro nodded, not with the usual firmness of an agent used to closing cases, but with the quiet humility of someone who understood what it meant to carry a community's hope. Rebecca stayed behind a little longer, walking through the nearly empty station corridors one last time. She remembered the tense night when everything almost slipped out of control, when people's tempers ran hot, and when the wrong choices could have easily buried the truth forever. Now those same halls felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if a fog had finally lifted. She paused at the notice board where the department had posted the reforms they were committing to, from independent reviews to new training measures. It wasn't a perfect fix, and she knew some would doubt it, but it was a start. The families of those affected received personal apologies, not scripted ones, and were promised follow-up meetings to ensure the promised changes actually happened. Some accepted quietly, some were more cautious, but all wanted one thing: to know their voices had finally been heard. The story had spread far beyond the town, sparking conversations in neighboring cities about accountability and the real meaning of justice. For Navarro and Rebecca, this wasn't about headlines or recognition. It was about ensuring that what happened here became a reminder for others, a reason to look closer before things ever reach this point elsewhere. Late that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rebecca found herself standing outside the building with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hand. Navarro joined her, leaning against the railing. They didn't talk much at first. The silence between them was no longer heavy with worry, but with a quiet kind of closure. "Do you think it'll hold?" she asked finally, her eyes following a group of kids riding past on their bikes. Navarro took a deep breath, then exhaled slowly. "It depends," he said. "Not just on them, but on all of us. On whether people stay involved, keep asking questions, keep expecting better." The night grew cooler, and the streets grew quieter. The station lights glowed softly behind them, no longer a place of whispered secrets, but one that now stood open to the scrutiny it had once resisted. Rebecca thought of the people she had met during this case. The shop owner who had spoken up despite the risk, the young officer who had chosen to tell the truth even when it put his career on the line, the families who refused to stay silent. Each of them had become part of the turning point that brought this story to its end. When they finally walked away, it wasn't with a sense of triumph, but with a sense of responsibility. The kind that doesn't end when the cameras leave or when the files are closed. It was the kind that lingers, that reminds you of the weight of even the smallest decision, and how easily trust can be broken or rebuilt one action at a time. In the quiet that followed, the town began to heal, slowly and unevenly, but with more honesty than before. The truth had been messy, the journey harder than anyone expected, but it had left behind something worth holding on to. The knowledge that change, while never easy, was always possible when people refused to look away.